Here is a paraphrased version of your script. I have preserved your original wording, articulation style, and core sentence structures as requested, changing only the order of clauses and phrases slightly to refresh the rhythm, while keeping the meaning identical. 2. I never believed there were truths missing from history. Not until the clean, comfortable textbook version I was taught started feeling incomplete. That's when I began asking a different kind of question. Not, what if Tartaria existed? That particular rabbit hole has been explored, debated, dismissed, and resurrected 1,000 times over. No. The question that truly kept me awake was far simpler and far more unsettling. What if it never fell at all? Imagine a civilization spanning continents. Imagine something suggesting humanity wasn't always dependent on centralized systems. A past where knowledge wasn't controlled, where technology didn't require their infrastructure, when we weren't slaves to the machinery that now defines existence. The architecture still stands. Those buildings with their impossible construction timelines, advanced engineering, and mysterious design principles, were told they were merely decorative, and then they vanished. But what if the mud flood never came? What if the eraser never happened? What if, instead of fragments, ruins, and suspicious gaps in the historical record, we lived in a world where that civilization simply continued? What would that world look like today? The deeper I went into this thought experiment, the more the edges of our current reality began to blur, and the more I realized we might be living in a deliberately degraded version of what was possible. Not just different, worse, intentionally worse. 100 times worse than the world we could have inherited. If that knowledge had never been suppressed, if those systems had never been dismantled, if someone hadn't decided that abundance was too dangerous to allow. Because once you start reconstructing what a surviving Tartaria might resemble, once you begin replacing the systems we take for granted with the systems suggested by pre-1900 architecture, something remarkable happens. You stop seeing an alternate history. You start seeing a better one. Picture this. You're standing in the heart of a modern metropolis, but instead of glass boxes and steel rectangles climbing toward a hazy sky, you're surrounded by buildings that seem to breathe. Instead of cold structures that drain the soul, these buildings are alive with the purpose of inspiration. Copper domes oxidized to celestial green. Facades are carved with geometric precision that would make a mathematician weep. Windows are positioned not just for views or light alone, but aligned to stellar coordinates. Sirius, Polaris, the path of the equinox sun. Every major city looks like this. Not just a few preserved districts, not just the old town tourist sections. Every city, Moscow, San Francisco, Melbourne, Shanghai, Johannesburg, all built according to the same fundamental principles, the same proportions, the same cosmic alignments, the same underlying mathematics. In this world, city planning isn't about property values or traffic flow. It's about resonance, harmony with invisible forces our current civilization pretends don't exist. Streets radiate from central hubs in perfect geometries. 7 pointed stars, octagonal patterns, Fibonacci spirals that mirror galactic arms. Public squares sit at line intersections. Buildings are designed to amplify specific frequencies, to channel atmospheric energy, to create standing waves of sound and light. The architecture isn't decoration. It's infrastructure. Ask yourself, in our world, why did we abandon this approach so completely? Why did every culture simultaneously decide that aesthetic beauty, mathematical precision, and cosmic alignment were irrelevant to building design? Why did the entire world agree, in the span of maybe 50 years, to replace stone, copper, and intricate metalwork with concrete, steel, and right angles? The official explanation is efficiency, cost, modern needs. But when you examine the buildings that do survive from that era, the ones we call Buics, arts or Victorian or neoclassical, as if those labels explain anything, they don't look less efficient. They look more advanced, more durable, more sophisticated. Buildings from the 1890s still standing solid, while structures from the 1990s crumble and leak. In the Tartarian survival scenario, we never made that switch. We never abandoned the old methods. Why would we? Why replace a proven system with an inferior one? Unless, of course, the system was never actually abandoned by choice. Unless it was taken. Here's where the alternate timeline gets genuinely disturbing. In the surviving Tartaria scenario, the social structure would necessarily be different from our current world, not because of political ideology or economic theory, but because of biology. Specifically, the biology we're not supposed to discuss. Those old photographs. You've seen them if you've gone down this research path. Unusually tall figures in Victorian-era images, doorways that seem excessive for average human heights, chairs, beds, and furniture in historical collections that appear oversized, ceilings in old buildings that rise to heights far beyond any practical purpose for standard human proportions. The official explanations vary. Photographic distortion, cultural preferences for grand spaces, misidentification of objects and their scale. Standard debunking, but the pattern repeats too consistently, too globally, too precisely. Skeletons of exceptional height discovered, and then quickly removed from public record. Archaeological findings that contradict the accepted timeline of human physical development. News clippings from the 1800s casually mentioning the discovery of remains belonging to a race of giants in burial mounds across North America, Europe, Asia, then silence. No follow-up, no further investigation, just nothing. In the Tartarian survival world, there would be no need to hide this. The taller subspecies, whether you call them giants elites or the remnant of an earlier human variant, would still exist. Not hidden, not suppressed, but integrated into the social hierarchy, perhaps as leaders, perhaps as technological specialists who maintain the energy infrastructure our smaller frames cannot easily access, perhaps as a separate class entirely, dwelling in those massive architectural spaces that seem absurdly oversized for average humans, but perfectly proportioned for 8-foot tall beings. The social implications are profound. Education would differ between classes, not because of oppression, but because of biological capability. Spiritual practices might differ. Access to certain knowledge might be restricted based on physical ability to interface with the technology. The massive pipe organs in old cathedrals, instruments that seem impossibly complex for human operation. Perhaps they were never meant for us. Perhaps they were control interfaces for beings with longer reach, greater lung capacity, and enhanced perception of harmonic frequencies. This isn't speculation divorced from evidence. The evidence exists. We just refuse to connect it. Those intricate control panels in old factories positioned 8 feet off the ground. Those peculiar chairs in historical collections that would be comically large for average humans. The repeated discoveries of oversized skeletal remains, all carefully removed from the historical record shortly after their initial reporting. In our timeline, this was erased, suppressed, removed from collective memory. In the Tartarian survival timeline, it's just normal. The social structure accommodates multiple human variants, each fulfilling roles suited to their capabilities. Not equality, perhaps, but also not the kind of predatory hierarchy we've constructed in our timeline. More like the natural order suggested by the architecture itself. Different scales for different purposes, all parts of a harmonious system. The education system would reflect this. Children of standard height learning different skills than children of greater stature. Not better or worse, but different, specialized. The architectural training for those who will maintain the energy domes and spires. The mathematical instruction for those who will calculate stellar alignments and harmonic frequencies. The spiritual practices for those who can perceive the subtle energies most humans cannot sense. And here's the strangest part. In removing this class structure, in erasing the evidence of biological variance, our timeline might have also erased the knowledge itself. If the giants were the keepers of certain technologies, the maintainers of specific systems, then their disappearance would necessarily mean the disappearance of that knowledge. Which is exactly what we observe in the historical record. The technology stops, the knowledge vanishes, the massive infrastructure falls into disuse, all in the same narrow time window when references to unusually tall humans disappear from public record. Correlation, perhaps, but the pattern is unnerving. Money is energy. Once you understand that, everything changes. In our timeline, banking is centralized, hierarchical. A small number of institutions control the flow of currency, determine who accesses it, extract percentage fees from every transaction. Money is debt-based, created through loans, requiring constant economic growth to service existing obligations. The system concentrates wealth upward, extracts value from the productive, rewards speculation over creation. We're told this is the natural order, the only sustainable model, the inevitable result of free markets and human nature. But the architecture from the pre-1900 era suggests something different. Those massive bank buildings, they don't look like our modern financial centers. They look like temples. Vaulted ceilings reaching toward the heavens. Intricate metalwork suggesting energy flow rather than wealth storage. Underground vaults that connect to the same subterranean systems as the energy infrastructure. Not separate systems, but integrated ones. In the Tartarian survival world, banking isn't about controlling money. It's about facilitating flow. Like the energy infrastructure, like the transportation networks, like the architectural systems. It's all based on circulation rather than extraction, on abundance rather than artificial scarcity. Imagine a financial system where currency represents actual productive capacity rather than debt obligation, where local communities issue their own currencies, backed by their own resources and labor, where central banks function as clearinghouses for exchange rather than controllers of money supply, where interest isn't extraction, but compensation for risk, and where speculation is impossible because value is tied to tangible reality rather than abstract financial instruments. This isn't utopian fantasy. This is what the evidence suggests existed. Those elaborate old bank buildings in every major city, all built according to similar principles, all featuring the same architectural elements, copper domes, precise geometric layouts, underground connections. They weren't designed for our modern banking model. They were designed for something else. Something that treated currency as energy, flow as natural abundance, as the default state rather than the exception. The transition to our current system happened in the same narrow window as everything else, the creation of central banks in the early 1900s, the shift from precious metal-backed currency to fiat money, the consolidation of financial power into fewer and fewer institutions. All of it happening simultaneously, globally, with remarkable coordination. And with it came the shift from abundance to scarcity, from distributed systems to centralized control, from wealth as the natural result of productive work to wealth as the extraction of value through financial manipulation. In the surviving Tartaria scenario, this transition never occurred. The financial system still operates on principles of flow rather than extraction. Communities maintain their own currencies. Resources circulate freely. There's no central authority controlling money supply, no debt-based currency creation, no compound interest extracting value from future generations. The social implications are staggering: no debt slavery, no boom-bust cycles, no artificial scarcity of basic resources, no financial aristocracy accumulating ever larger percentages of total wealth while productive workers struggle. The evidence for this alternate system exists in those buildings, in the way they're designed, in what they connect to, in how they functioned before the transition. The question isn't whether a different system is possible. The question is, why did we abandon the one that existed? Modern technology is violent, extractive, exploitative. We mine the earth for rare materials. We blast mountains for coal. We drill through ocean floors for oil. We cut forests for resources. We treat the planet as an inert stockpile to be consumed, converted, depleted. And we call this progress. But the old world technology, the technology suggested by those preserved structures, those mysterious energy systems, those architectural principles we've dismissed as decorative, operated on completely different assumptions. Not domination of nature, but harmony with it. Not extraction, but resonance. Not consumption, but circulation. In the Tartarian survival scenario, technology continues developing along these lines. Not computers made from conflict minerals extracted by child labor. Not smartphones designed for obsolescence and toxic waste disposal. Not renewable energy that still requires massive resource extraction for solar panels and wind turbines. Instead, technology that works with natural energy flows rather than against them. Devices powered by ambient atmospheric electricity. Materials that last indefinitely because they're made from aligned substances rather than synthetic composites. Systems that enhance natural processes rather than replacing them. The acoustic technology alone would be revolutionary. Those massive pipe organs in old buildings weren't just musical instruments. The precise metalwork of Victorian machinery wasn't just decoration. The geometric patterns covering old world architecture weren't just aesthetic choices. They were functional, designed to focus, amplify, and direct sound waves for practical purposes. Sound as a construction tool. Sound as medical treatment. Sound as a communication system. Sound as an energy amplifier. In our timeline, we retain glimpses of this. Acoustic levitation in laboratory settings, ultrasound in medicine, sonar for detection, but always as isolated technologies, never as a unified system, never as the foundational principle underlying civilization itself. In the survival timeline, acoustic technology would be everywhere. Buildings designed as resonance chambers, transportation systems using standing wave harmonics, medical facilities that diagnose and treat through frequency rather than invasive procedures, communication networks transmitting information through atmospheric resonance rather than electromagnetic radiation. The health implications alone are staggering. In our world, we're bathed in artificial electromagnetic frequencies from cell towers, Wi-Fi routers, power lines, wireless devices, frequencies that interfere with natural biological rhythms, that disrupt cellular communication, that contribute to chronic illness epidemics our medicine can barely address. In the Tartarian survival world, technology enhances biological function rather than disrupting it. The frequencies generated by the architectural infrastructure resonate with human biorhythms. The energy system supports cellular health. The built environment facilitates healing rather than causing illness. Population health would be radically different. No cancer epidemics, no chronic degenerative diseases, no autoimmune conditions at current rates. Not because of superior medicine, but because the environmental factors causing those conditions never existed. The technology itself, the very infrastructure of civilization, supports health rather than undermining it. And the atmospheric technology. This is where the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. Those spires on old buildings reaching toward the sky like fingers grasping at something invisible. Those elaborate metalwork patterns covering domes and roofs. Those strange devices photographed atop structures in historical images. Devices that look like antennas, like collectors, like interfaces with something in the air itself. In our timeline, we're told these are lightning rods, decorative elements, architectural flourishes. But lightning rods are simply a metal rod grounded to Earth. These structures are complex, precise, geometric. They suggest collection rather than dissipation, amplification rather than protection. What if they're doing exactly what they appear to be doing? Collecting atmospheric energy, interfacing with the ionosphere, drawing power from the electrical potential that exists in the air itself, the Earth itself, the space between. In the survival scenario, this technology is common knowledge. Every building is a power collector. The atmosphere is the grid. Energy is as free and abundant as air itself. No power plants, no electrical infrastructure, no utility companies, no energy bills. The social transformation this would enable is beyond calculation. When energy is free, when power is abundant, when the fundamental resource underlying modern civilization is no longer artificially scarce, the entire economic order changes. The control mechanisms dissolve. The hierarchies based on resource access collapse, which explains, perhaps, why this system couldn't be allowed to continue. In our timeline, transportation means engines, internal combustion, jet fuel, diesel, gasoline. We move by burning things, by converting stored chemical energy into mechanical motion. It's dirty, loud, inefficient. But it's what we have. What we're told is the only option that ever existed. But the evidence from pre-1900 infrastructure tells a different story. Those elaborate railway systems that appeared seemingly overnight across continents. Transcontinental railways built in impossibly short time frames with supposedly primitive tools. Stations that look like palaces, with vaulted ceilings and geometric precision that rivals any cathedral. These weren't just transportation hubs. They were part of that same energy network. The rails themselves, cast iron, perfectly parallel, stretching across deserts and mountains with mathematical precision. They weren't just tracks. They were conductors. The ornate stations with their copper domes and metallic fixtures weren't for passenger comfort. They were power nodes. The whole system functioned as a continent-spanning circuit, using atmospheric and telluric energy to propel vehicles without any onboard fuel source. In the Tartarian survival world, this system never stopped functioning. Imagine you board a train in Moscow. No diesel engine, no coal tender, just elegant passenger cars connecting to magnetized rails that draw power from the Earth itself and the atmosphere above. The stations you pass through aren't just stops. They're amplifiers, resonance chambers that boost the energy flowing through the network. You cross continents in silence and comfort, without burning a single drop of fuel. The technology existed, the infrastructure was built, and then, suddenly, it wasn't. The transition to combustion engines doesn't make sense when you examine it closely. Steam locomotives, loud, inefficient, requiring constant fuel and water, replaced a system that needed neither. Why? The official answer is always the same: technological progress. But progress toward what? Toward a system that required expensive fuel, constant maintenance, and produced toxic smoke. That's not progress, that's dependence. And once you see the pattern, once you understand that the shift from wireless atmospheric energy to fossil fuel combustion happened simultaneously across the entire developed world, all within the same narrow time window, all with remarkably similar infrastructure changes, all accompanied by the dismantling of those ornate stations and the removal of certain architectural features from existing buildings. The official narrative begins to collapse. In the survival scenario, trains still run on the old system. So do trams, those elaborate networks of overhead wires in historic city photos. They weren't just for electric streetcars drawing power from coal plants. They were collectors, receivers, part of a wireless energy distribution network that used the wires as resonators, not power lines. No fossil fuels required, no combustion, no dependence on finite resources controlled by centralized powers. Which raises a simple but critical question. Who benefits from a world running on scarce, purchasable fuel instead of abundant free energy? In our world, education is information transfer. Memorization, standardization, sit in rows, absorb facts, regurgitate on tests. Creativity as an afterthought. Individual potential as statistical variance to be normalized. But in the Tartarian survival scenario, education would be fundamentally different. Because if the technology runs on frequency, on resonance, on harmonic alignment with natural forces, then education isn't about memorizing information. It's about tuning consciousness. Those magnificent old-school buildings, the ones that look like cathedrals with vaulted ceilings, precise acoustic properties, and architectural proportions that mirror sacred geometry. They weren't designed that way for aesthetics. They were learning environments optimized for specific cognitive states. Spaces that facilitate the perception of subtle energies, that amplify certain brainwave frequencies, that create conditions for enhanced learning through resonance rather than repetition. In the surviving timeline, these buildings are still in use, still functioning as intended. Children learn mathematics not through rote memorization, but through direct perception of harmonic relationships. They learn physics not through abstract formulas, but through hands-on interaction with the energy infrastructure. They learn history not through sanitized textbooks, but through preserved records of continuous civilization. No dark ages, no lost centuries, no convenient gaps in the historical record. The curriculum would emphasize different skills than our timeline frequency perception. Harmonic calculation, stellar navigation, the operation and maintenance of atmospheric energy collectors, how to read the flow of telluric currents, how to align structures with beneficial cosmic forces, how to work with materials, copper, iron, stone, water, as living elements rather than inert resources. And the results would be visible in the population itself, healthier, more coherent, operating at a higher baseline frequency than the stressed, disconnected, overstimulated populations of our timeline. Because the built environment supports elevated consciousness rather than suppressing it. Because the energy infrastructure provides clean, abundant power rather than toxic emissions. Because the educational system develops innate abilities rather than standardizing them away. The contrast is stark. In our world, we spend billions on education while populations become progressively less capable of critical thinking, less connected to natural cycles, less aware of the energetic realities underlying physical existence. In the Tartarian survival world, education would enhance those connections, strengthen them, build on them, which raises an uncomfortable question. What if our educational system isn't broken? What if it's working exactly as designed, producing compliant workers rather than conscious individuals, consumers rather than creators, people who accept official narratives rather than questioning fundamental assumptions? The old schools suggest a different model was possible, that it existed, that it worked, and then it stopped. In our timeline, geopolitics is energy politics. Control of oil fields determines alliances and conflicts. Pipelines dictate foreign policy. Access to fossil fuels shapes wars, coups, and regime changes. The entire global power structure is built on who controls the resources required to make civilization function. But strip away petroleum dependence, and the entire geopolitical landscape transforms. In the Tartarian survival world, there are no oil-producing nations with outsized influence. No environmental disasters from tanker spills or pipeline ruptures, because the energy infrastructure doesn't require extraction. It requires knowledge. Knowledge of how to build, maintain, and operate the atmospheric and telluric energy systems. Power belongs to those who understand the technology, not those who sit atop resource deposits. The borders themselves would be different. In our timeline, nation-states emerged as competition for resources intensified. In the survival scenario, with abundant energy freely available, the motivation for territorial conquest shifts. Nations might form around shared architectural principles, common understandings of harmonic science, or collaborative maintenance of the global energy grid. Continental power structures would reflect technological sophistication rather than resource access. Regions that preserve the most intact infrastructure, that maintain the highest level of architectural knowledge, that train the most capable frequency technicians. They would hold influence not through military dominance or resource monopoly, but through expertise. Wars might still occur. Humans are humans. But they wouldn't be resource wars. They would be knowledge wars. Conflicts over who controls understanding, who determines standards, who sets the parameters for energy distribution. Very different from oil wars and pipeline politics. And the timeline of industrialization would be completely rewritten. In our world, industrialization meant factories, coal smoke, environmental destruction, worker exploitation in service of mechanized production. In the Tartarian survival timeline, industrialization means something else entirely. The widespread application of harmonic principles to manufacturing. The use of atmospheric energy to power tools and machinery, the integration of human craftsmanship with frequency-based automation. No sweatshops, no toxic emissions, no sacrifice of human health for productive output. The preserved records from the late 1800s, those elaborate factories with vaulted ceilings and precise architecture, suggest exactly this model. Not dark satanic mills, but spaces designed for both productivity and human well-being. Manufacturing facilities that function as resonance chambers, amplifying worker capacity rather than depleting it. In the survival scenario, these principles were never abandoned. Manufacturing remains decentralized, human-scaled, integrated with the energy grid. Products are built to last centuries, not to break after planned obsolescence. Craftsmanship is valued over mass production, quality over quantity. The economic model is fundamentally different. No compulsion toward infinite growth. No drive to extract maximum short-term profit. No corporate consolidation creating monopolies. Because the energy abundance removes the artificial scarcity that drives those behaviors. And the global trade networks would reflect this. Not container ships burning bunker fuel across oceans, not aircraft burning jet fuel overhead, but advanced rail systems spanning continents, electromagnetic vessels using telluric currents for propulsion, trade based on actual value exchange rather than currency manipulation. The preserved maps from pre-1900 suggest these networks existed. Railway lines crossing terrain deemed impossible by modern engineering, shipping routes utilizing currents, and electromagnetic anomalies for propulsion. Global infrastructure that connected continents more effectively than our current systems, all without fossil fuel consumption. Then the maps change. Routes disappear. Infrastructure is removed from the historical record, and we're told it never existed. But the foundation stones remain. The underground networks persist. The architectural evidence stands silent in city centers worldwide. In the survival timeline, those networks are still operational, still connecting civilizations, still facilitating trade and communication across vast distances without environmental destruction. Which brings us to the uncomfortable realization. Our current geopolitical order, with all its conflicts, resource wars, and environmental devastation, might not be inevitable. It might not be the natural result of human civilization developing. It might be the specific result of suppressing one system and replacing it with another. A system designed not for human flourishing, but for control. The cathedrals tell you everything. Not the stripped down modern churches with their bare walls, fluorescent lights, and uncomfortable pews. The old cathedrals. The ones that make you feel something when you enter. The ones with precise acoustics, with golden ratio proportions, with light filtering through stained glass in patterns that seem to bypass your eyes and speak directly to something deeper. Those weren't just built for worship. They were technology masquerading as architecture, or architecture serving as technology. The distinction blurs when you understand what they were actually doing. In the Tartarian survival world, the separation between spirituality and science never occurred, because it was always a false separation. The cathedrals demonstrate this. They're simultaneously sacred spaces and energy amplifiers, places of worship and frequency generators, spiritual centers and technological hubs. The pipe organs, those massive instruments with thousands of pipes arranged in precise configurations. They weren't just making music. They were creating standing wave patterns, harmonic frequencies that affect consciousness directly. The acoustics of the space itself, carefully calculated to produce specific reverberations, specific resonances that facilitate altered states of awareness. Modern neuroscience is only beginning to understand what the old builders knew. Certain frequencies affect brain states. Specific harmonic patterns can induce meditation, ecstasy, heightened perception. Sound can heal. Sound can elevate consciousness. Sound can quite literally change reality. In the survival timeline, this knowledge was never lost. Spiritual practice and technological understanding remain integrated. The same people who maintain the energy infrastructure also facilitate spiritual development. The same architectural principles that collect atmospheric power also create spaces for consciousness expansion. Education in this world includes training in meditation, in frequency perception, in direct experience of subtle energies. Not as religious dogma, but as practical skill, like learning to read, to calculate, to operate machinery. Consciousness development is foundational, not fringe. The population health benefits cascade from this. When people are trained from childhood to perceive subtle energies, to maintain coherent mental states, to recognize and adjust their own frequency patterns, mental illness rates plummet. Addiction becomes rare. Violence decreases, not through medication or enforcement, but through elevated baseline consciousness. Those massive public buildings in every major city, the ones we now use as museums, government offices, tourist attractions. In the survival scenario, they're still functioning as consciousness centers. Public spaces designed for collective meditation, for community coherence, for the amplification of positive intentions through architectural resonance. The cynical modern mind recoils at this. It sounds like mysticism, like unscientific nonsense. But the buildings themselves are scientific. The proportions are mathematical. The acoustic properties are measurable. The effects of specific frequencies on consciousness are demonstrable in laboratory settings. Right now, in our timeline, with our incomplete understanding, imagine what's possible with complete knowledge, with civilizations' worth of accumulated wisdom about consciousness, frequency, and reality itself. In the Tartarian survival world, spirituality isn't belief-based. It's experience-based. People don't believe in higher states of consciousness. They achieve them regularly through architectural technology and trained practice. The cathedrals facilitate what they were always meant to facilitate: direct experience of expanded awareness, and the social structure reflects this. Leadership isn't about charisma, wealth accumulation, or political maneuvering. It's about demonstrated consciousness capability, about frequency coherence, about the ability to perceive and work with subtle energies. Those who can maintain the highest levels of awareness, who can operate the most sophisticated frequency technologies, who can facilitate collective elevation. They guide, they teach, they serve. Not because of imposed hierarchy, but because of natural recognition. You can't fake frequency coherence. You can't pretend to perceive what you cannot perceive. The technology itself identifies capability. Contrast this with our timeline: leaders selected through popularity contests or hereditary privilege. Consciousness development relegated to fringe practices and dismissed as unscientific. Spiritual experience commodified or pathologized. The very idea that buildings could be designed to elevate awareness treated as a lunatic conspiracy theory. Yet the buildings remain. The cathedrals still inspire awe. The proportions still affect those who experience them. The acoustic properties still function as designed. We just forgot what they were designed to do, or we were made to forget. The buildings tell you everything, if you know how to read them. In our world, modern architecture is deliberately ugly, sterile, dehumanizing. Glass boxes that make you feel small, concrete structures that repel rather than welcome. Spaces designed for efficiency, not beauty, not harmony, certainly not transcendence. We're told this is modernism, progress, form following function. But when you compare modern buildings to what came before, those old world structures we now call historical landmarks, the contrast is violent. The older buildings inspire awe. They incorporate golden ratios, sacred geometry, acoustic optimization. They make you feel something when you enter them. They elevate consciousness rather than suppressing it. In a world where Tartaria survived, where the architectural knowledge was never lost, modern buildings still follow those principles. Because why wouldn't they? Why would you deliberately choose to create ugly, disharmonious spaces when you know how to create beautiful, resonant ones? Unless, of course, the ugliness serves a purpose. The deeper I looked into the architectural transition, specifically that narrow window between roughly 1890 and 1920, when building styles changed everywhere, simultaneously across every culture, the more a pattern emerged. It wasn't gradual evolution, it was replacement. Demolition of the old, construction of the new, often using the old foundations and the old underground systems, but with completely different superstructures. World's fairs played a crucial role: massive, elaborate, temporary structures built in impossibly short time frames only to be torn down immediately after. Buildings that looked like permanent architectural masterpieces, supposedly constructed from plaster and wood, then demolished without explanation. The official story, temporary exhibitions, makes no economic or logical sense. But it makes perfect sense if those weren't new constructions at all. If they were existing structures, remnants of the previous civilization, repurposed briefly for public display before their final removal. The World's Fairs as controlled demolition events disguised as celebrations of progress. In the Tartarian survival timeline, those buildings were never torn down. They were renovated, integrated, maintained. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair structures still standing, still in use, converted into universities, government centers, public spaces. The same in Paris, San Francisco, Melbourne. not replicas or reconstructions, but the original architecture of a civilization that understood frequency, resonance, and cosmic alignment. Modern skylines in this alternate world would be unrecognizable to us, not because they're primitive, but because they're advanced in directions our timeline rejected. Buildings that spiral according to Fibonacci sequences, domes that create standing wave harmonics, facades that function as antenna arrays, cities designed as coherent systems rather than chaotic accumulations of competing property interests. And the social implications of this are staggering, because architecture shapes consciousness. Spaces designed according to sacred geometry, aligned to celestial mechanics, built with harmonic proportions. They affect how people think, how they feel, how they interact with reality itself. You can't separate the built environment from human psychology. You can't isolate urban design from social structure. In the Tartarian survival world, people live in environments that actively elevate consciousness rather than suppress it. Educational buildings designed as resonance chambers, government centers that incorporate acoustic optimization for clarity of communication, residential spaces that align with natural cycles that facilitate rest and creativity rather than exhaustion and compliance. The contrast with our timeline is devastating. Ask yourself, why did we abandon beauty? Why did we choose ugliness? Why did we replace inspiration with oppression, harmony with discord, natural materials with synthetic ones? The official answer: cost, efficiency, modernization, doesn't hold when you examine the evidence. Those old buildings were more durable, more efficient, more cost-effective over their lifetime than anything we build today. So why did we stop building them? Unless we didn't stop, unless they were stopped for us. Here's where the alternate timeline becomes impossible to ignore. In our world, we're told that civilization runs on fossil fuels because we discovered them, harnessed them, built an entire global infrastructure around them. Coal, oil, natural gas, extracted, refined, burned, repeated. The Industrial Revolution gave us steam power, which gave us factories, which gave us modern life, simple progression, linear development. But in a world where Tartaria survived, where the knowledge wasn't lost or suppressed or deliberately erased, we would never have needed fossil fuels in the first place, because the architecture itself generates power. Not solar panels bolted onto roofs as an afterthought, not wind turbines disrupting landscapes. The buildings themselves, those copper domes, those metallic spires, those geometric forms aligned to celestial mechanics, they are the energy infrastructure. Atmospheric energy collection, telluric current harvesting, resonance amplification through architectural form. Every major structure is a node in a wireless power grid. The spires aren't decorative, they're antennas. The domes aren't aesthetic choices, they're collectors. Those intricate metal ornamentations covering 19th century buildings, fractal patterns designed to capture and focus electromagnetic frequencies. The underground networks beneath every old city, the sewers and catacombs and forgotten tunnels. They're not drainage systems. They're conductive pathways, distribution channels for energy flowing through the earth itself. And the pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Every major city from that era has them: Paris, London, New York, Melbourne, all built atop massive underground complexes of brick, vaulted chambers, metal piping, water channels flowing in patterns that make no sense for drainage, but perfect sense for hydraulic energy distribution. These systems connected to natural water sources. They utilized pressure differentials. They created standing waves. They provided free wireless energy to an entire civilization. In the survival timeline, this infrastructure was never dismantled. It was maintained, upgraded, expanded. Modern cities in this alternate world look like steampunk fantasies made real, not because of aesthetic choice, but because that technology works. Street lights powered by atmospheric resonance, trains running on magnetic rails charged by telluric currents, buildings that generate more energy than they consume, feeding excess back into the grid through those ornamental spires we dismissed as mere decoration. No coal mines, no oil wells, no fracking, no pipelines, no gas stations, no carbon emissions. The question isn't whether this technology is possible. The evidence suggests it already existed. The question is, why did it stop? And here we arrive at the central mystery. Not what existed. The evidence for that is overwhelming once you start looking. Not how it worked. The principles are visible in the architecture, deducible from the infrastructure, consistent with physics we're only beginning to understand. The question is, why did it stop? Why did the entire world simultaneously abandon a system that provided free energy, advanced transportation, architectural beauty, elevated consciousness, decentralized power structures, and sustainable technology? Why did every culture on every continent decide, in the span of maybe 3 decades, to replace all of this with coal smoke, oil dependence, centralized banking, ugly buildings, and environmental destruction? The official explanations don't hold. Not when you examine them. Economic efficiency doesn't explain why more durable, more beautiful, more functional systems were replaced with inferior ones. Technological progress doesn't explain why advancement meant abandoning working systems that achieved what we're still struggling to achieve today. Natural evolution doesn't explain the simultaneity, the coordination, the completeness of the erasure. Something happened. Something big enough to reset global civilization, fast enough to occur within a single generation, complete enough to remove almost all knowledge of the previous system from collective memory. The mud-flood hypothesis suggests a cataclysm, buried cities, sudden destruction. But in our survival scenario, we're asking a different question. What if the destruction wasn't natural? What if it was deliberate, not a flood, but a purge? The evidence for systematic destruction is everywhere once you look. Those World's Fairs where elaborate buildings were erected temporarily, then demolished. Those urban renewal projects in the early 1900s where entire city centers were razed and rebuilt. Those mysterious fires that consumed the architectural centers of city after city. San Francisco, Chicago, Boston, and hundreds of smaller cities, all within the same narrow time window, always destroying the old structures, always making way for the new. The pattern is too consistent, too complete, too well coordinated. And the documentary record, the records of who made these decisions, why they were made, what systems were being replaced, and why. That documentation is suspiciously sparse, missing, classified, or simply not discussed. We have endless records of building construction, but very few records of systematic demolition. We have photographs of elaborate structures, but minimal documentation of their destruction. We have evidence of advanced systems, but no explanation for their abandonment. Just silence. The silence was deafening, actually. The absence of discussion, the lack of public debate, the unanimous consent across all levels of society, all institutions, all nations to simply stop. Stop asking questions. Stop preserving the old system. Stop teaching the old knowledge. One generation knows, the next generation doesn't. No transition period, no gradual loss. Just absence where presence used to be. In the Tartarian survival scenario, this moment of erasure never occurs. The knowledge continues. The systems remain operational. The architecture stands maintained. Continuity instead of catastrophic loss. But in our timeline, something broke that continuity. Something powerful enough to override all resistance, all questioning, all institutional memory. Something that could coordinate globally, act swiftly, and enforce silence afterward. What has that kind of power? Not a natural disaster, not a disease, not a war, though wars certainly help destroy remaining infrastructure under cover of conflict. The deeper I looked, the more I found evidence of deliberate policy, the creation of new building codes that prohibited certain architectural features, the consolidation of banking systems under central authorities, the standardization of education to remove certain subjects from curricula, the systematic purchase and closure of local power generation systems, the criminalization of alternative energy research. All of it happening in that same narrow window. All of it coordinated. All of it presented as progress, modernization, necessary reform, and all of it resulting in the world we have now centralized, controlled, dependent. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. I started this investigation asking what the world would look like if Tartaria survived. I'm ending it asking something different. What if it did? What if the alternate timeline isn't the one where they survived, but the one where we've do? What if we're living in the aberration, the deviation, the timeline that broke from the natural progression? What if somewhere, in some parallel possibility, some branching path of history, there exists a world where the mudflood never came, where the knowledge was never erased, where the systems continued functioning as designed, a world where cities are beautiful, where energy is abundant, where consciousness is elevated rather than suppressed, where technology enhances rather than destroys, where social structure serves human flourishing rather than extraction and control. It's not utopian fantasy. Every element I've described is based on evidence from our own timeline, on architecture that still stands, on systems that demonstrably worked, on knowledge that existed until it didn't. The survival scenario isn't imaginary, it's remembered, or more accurately, it's half remembered. Glimpsed in the spaces between official narratives, visible in the structures they couldn't quite destroy, present in the persistent questions that won't go away no matter how many debunking articles are written. Why do old buildings look advanced? Why did architectural quality decline after 1900? Where did the free energy technology go? Why were city centers systematically demolished? What happened to the giants? Why don't we teach frequency science? Who benefited from the transition to fossil fuels? What was really destroyed in those mysterious fires? Why does official history feel incomplete? These questions persist because something in us recognizes the wrongness, the loss, the deviation from what should have been. In the Tartarian survival timeline, none of these are questions. They're just history, continuity, the normal progression of a civilization that never broke. But we're in the broken timeline, the one where something went terribly wrong, terribly quickly, terribly completely, where knowledge was lost, systems were destroyed, beauty was abandoned, consciousness was suppressed, abundance was replaced with artificial scarcity. And we're told this is progress. The truly haunting part isn't that an advanced civilization might have existed and fallen. That's tragedy, but comprehensible. Civilizations rise and fall, knowledge gets lost. It happens throughout history. No, the haunting part is the possibility that it didn't fall naturally, that it was pushed. That the world we inhabit now, with its problems, its suffering, its unnecessary scarcity, its environmental destruction, its suppressed human potential. This world is the result of deliberate choices made by those who benefited from the transition. That free energy was suppressed not because it didn't work, but because it worked too well. Because you can't control people who have abundant resources. You can't extract wealth from people who don't need what you're selling. You can't maintain hierarchies when the fundamental tools of civilization are freely available to everyone. That perhaps the entire modern world, our wars, our economics, our politics, our environmental crisis, stems from the suppression of one system and the implementation of another, not evolution, replacement. The evidence suggests this. The pattern supports it. The architecture testifies to it. But the deeper truth is unknowable from inside our timeline. We can see the shadows. We can measure the gaps. We can notice the anomalies. But we can't fully reconstruct what was lost from within the system that replaced it. We can only wonder. And in wondering, in questioning, in refusing to accept the official narrative as complete, maybe that's where the real investigation begins. Not in reconstructing the past, but in recognizing what's missing. Not in improving what existed, but in questioning the present. Because if Tartaria survived in some alternate branch of reality, if there exists a world where the old systems continued, where knowledge was preserved, where human potential wasn't artificially limited, then our world's problems aren't inevitable. They're the result of specific choices. Choices that could theoretically be unmade. Knowledge that could theoretically be recovered. Systems that could theoretically be rebuilt. The survival scenario isn't just an interesting thought experiment. It's a mirror, showing us what we lost, what we gave up, what was taken from us, and what perhaps we might someday reclaim. I can't give you definitive answers. That's not the nature of this investigation. The evidence is there. In the architecture, in the historical record, in the gaps and silences. But it's incomplete, fragmented, deliberately obscured, or accidentally lost. The result is the same. We're working with pieces of a puzzle whose full picture we may never see. But certain questions demand to be asked. If atmospheric energy collection was possible, if the technology existed and functioned, why are we still burning fossil fuels? If the old architectural systems created healthier environments and more beautiful cities, why did we abandon them for concrete and glass? If free energy systems were operational, who decided they should stop? Who benefited from that decision? Who benefits still if giants or unusually tall humans existed alongside standard height populations? Where did they go? Why the silence? Why the removal of evidence? If consciousness, elevating architecture, was understood and implemented globally, why don't we teach these principles now? Why are they relegated to conspiracy theory and fringe research? If the systems worked, if they provided abundance, beauty, health, and sustainability, why would any civilization voluntarily abandon them? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're investigative ones, and they point toward uncomfortable possibilities about the world we actually inhabit versus the world we could have inherited. The Tartarian survival scenario isn't just alternate history. It's a lens, a way of examining our present through the contrast of what might have been. And in that examination, in that comparison, we begin to see the chains we're wearing, the limitations we accept as natural that are actually imposed, the scarcity we're taught is inevitable that might be artificial. I don't know if Tartaria existed as a unified empire. I don't know if the mud flood was real or metaphorical or misidentified. I don't know who made the decisions that led us to this timeline instead of another. But I know the buildings are real. The technology was real. The knowledge existed. The systems functioned, and then they stopped. That transition, that moment of cessation, that point of no return where one system ended and another began. That's where the real mystery lies. Not in reconstructing what was, but in understanding what happened and why. We're not allowed to ask. The investigation continues. The questions remain. The architecture stands silent, holding secrets we've forgotten how to read. But we're learning again, slowly, carefully, piece by piece, because some knowledge, once seen, cannot be unseen. Some patterns, once recognized, cannot be forgotten. Some questions, once asked, cannot be unasked. The old world might be gone, but its echo remains. In every cathedral that still inspires awe. In every underground tunnel that serves purposes we don't quite understand. In every old building with proportions that suggest knowledge we've lost. The echo remains, and echoes can teach us, show us, remind us of what was and what could be again. If we're willing to listen, if we're brave enough to question, if we're persistent enough to look beyond the official narratives and see what's actually there. The world that didn't end, the civilization that survived, in some other timeline, some other possibility. But maybe, just maybe, it survived in this one too. Hidden, suppressed, waiting for us to remember.